Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 9 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 9. Question number 322. A serverless application contains many Lambda functions. Users report intermittent slowness during high traffic, but no invocations fail. The developer needs to identify and rank the slowest individual executions across all function log groups. Which solution meets the requirement most directly? Option A. Use Glue to export every log group to S3 before analyzing duration. Option B. Enable Cloud Trail Insights to detect slow Lambda handler executions. Option C. Run a CloudWatch Logs Insights query across the Lambda log groups, select Report Records, and sort by execution duration in descending order. Option D. Use only X-ray insights to inspect anomalies after changing every function's tracing configuration. The correct answer is C. Run a CloudWatch Logs Insights query across the Lambda log groups, select Report Records, and sort by execution duration in descending order. Here is why. Lambda report log events include execution duration, and Logs Insights can query multiple log groups and rank individual invocations without requiring failures. Why are the other options not correct? A glue creates an unnecessary export in ETL pipeline. B. Cloud Trail Insights detects unusual API activity, not handler duration. D. X-ray is valuable for traces but requires tracing data, and is less direct for ranking existing report records. Exam tip. Query Lambda report events in Logs Insights to compare invocation duration, memory use, and build duration. Question number 323. A Lambda-backed API gateway application must support development, test, and production without duplicating source code or introducing container platforms. Which approach requires the least development effort? Option A. Copy the application code for every environment and deploy separate copies manually. Option B. Use API gateway stages and stage variables with Lambda aliases for environment-specific versions and resources. Option C. Deploy the serverless application through Elastic Beanstalk. Option D. Repackage the application for ECS. The correct answer is B. Use API gateway stages and stage variables with Lambda aliases for environment-specific versions and resources. Here is why. Stages provide separate API environments, stage variables provide environment-specific values, and aliases give stable references to Lambda versions. Why are the other options not correct? A duplicating code increases maintenance and drift. C. Elastic Beanstalk is unnecessary for the serverless architecture. DCS introduces container packaging and cluster resources. Exam tip. Combine API gateway stages with Lambda aliases to manage serverless environments without copying application code. Question number 324. One CloudFormation template creates an API gateway endpoint and a step function state machine. The state machine definition must contain the deployed API endpoint without adding a paid configuration or secret storage service. Which CloudFormation feature should the developer use? Option A. Pass the endpoint through definition substitutions on the AWS step functions state machine resource. Option B. Store the endpoint in Secrets Manager and retrieve it during every execution. Option C. Put the endpoint in an AppConfig configuration profile. Option D. Configure a step functions environment variable. The correct answer is A. Pass the endpoint through definition substitutions on the AWS step functions state machine resource. Here is why. Definition substitutions replaces placeholders in the state machine definition with values created by the same stack, including the API endpoint. Why are the other options not correct? B. A non-secret endpoint does not need Secrets Manager or retrieval cost. C. AppConfig adds an unnecessary configuration resource. D. Step function state machines do not provide Lambda-style environment variables. Exam tip. Use definition substitutions to inject CloudFormation resource values into an inline or S3-based state machine definition. Question number 325. An organization requires IAM roles to be created through CloudFormation, CloudTrail records, a direct create role API call, and the security team must receive an immediate SNS notification when the call did not originate from CloudFormation. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Run an EC2 cron script every 15 minutes to search CloudTrail. Option B. Run a scheduled Fargate task every 15 minutes. Option C. Invoke a scheduled Lambda function every 15 minutes to search CloudTrail. Option D. Create an event bridge rule that matches the relevant CloudTrail create role event and sends the event to the SNS topic. The correct answer is D. Create an event bridge rule that matches the relevant CloudTrail create role event and sends the event to the SNS topic. Here is why. EventBridge receives CloudTrail management events and can immediately match create role details and route matching events to SNS without polling infrastructure. Why are the other options not correct? A EC2 cron adds servers and notification delay. B. Scheduled Fargate requires a container and polling logic. C. Scheduled Lambda still polls every 15 minutes instead of reacting to the event. Exam tip. Use EventBridge patterns on CloudTrail API events for near real-time governance notifications. Question number 326. A DynamoDB table will receive a sudden surge of 1 early access request per user. Item includes a unique username, a submission date, one of 3 validation statuses, and a rating from 1 through 5. The partition key must distribute writes across many partition key values. Which attribute is the best partition key? Option A. Validation status. Option B. Username. Option C. Rating. Option D. Submission date. The correct answer is B. Username. Here is why. Each user submits once, so username has high cardinality and distributes writes across many partition key values. Why are the other options not correct? A 3 status values concentrate traffic into hot partitions. C. 5 rating values have very low cardinality. D. Many users can share the same submission date, especially during a launch search. Exam tip. Choose a high cardinality DynamoDB partition key that spreads requests rather than grouping a burst under a few values. Question number 327. A public static site is delivered through CloudFront from a private S3 bucket. Viewers must not be able to bypass CloudFront and retrieve objects by using S3 URLs. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use the S3 website endpoint as the CloudFront origin. Option B. Send a custom header and evaluate it through an AWS request tag condition in the bucket policy. Option C. Create and associate a CloudFront origin access control, keep S3 block public access enabled, and grant the CloudFront service principal the required object access in the bucket policy. Option D. Grant CloudFront write-only access to a blocked private bucket without configuring OAC. The correct answer is C. Create and associate a CloudFront origin access control, keep S3 block public access enabled, and grant the CloudFront service principal the required object access in the bucket policy. Here is why. OAC signs CloudFront origin requests, and the bucket policy permits the distribution while public S3 access remains blocked. Why are the other options not correct? A. An S3 website endpoint cannot use OAC and normally requires public access. B. AWS request tag does not validate a custom HTTP header for S3 object access. D. Write-only permission cannot retrieve site objects and does not authenticate CloudFront without OAC. Exam tip. Use CloudFront OAC plus a source unscoped bucket policy to keep an S3 origin private. Question number 328. An e-commerce application integrates with payment APIs that have no sandbox environment. The developer needs local test endpoints that return representative captured responses without sending requests to the real payment providers. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Create a PI gateway REST APIs with mock integrations and configure sample integration responses for the provider operations. Option B. Use API gateway responses for successful backend calls. Option C. Create Lambda functions and route their ARNs through Route 53 Resolver inbound endpoints. Option D. Configure AppSync data sources with an unsupported mock integration type. The correct answer is A. Create API gateway REST APIs with mock integrations and configure sample integration responses for the provider operations. Here is why. Mock integrations return controlled payloads without invoking the unavailable third-party systems, allowing deterministic integration code testing. Why are the other options not correct? B. Gateway responses customize API gateway-generated errors rather than normal mock operations. C. Route 53 resolver cannot route a DNS endpoint to a lambda ARN in this manner. D. AppSync does not provide the described mock data source integration. Exam tip. Use API gateway mock integrations to emulate unavailable external APIs during development and testing. Question number 329. An application stores a very large number of objects in one S3 bucket and expects request rates beyond the per prefix baseline. The developer wants to increase aggregate request throughput. How should the object keys be designed? Option A. Add an object tag named prefix to every object. Option B. Store every object under the same root key namespace. Option C. Select S3 intelligent tiering for every object. Option D. Distribute object key names across multiple prefixes and parallelize requests. The correct answer is D. Distribute object key names across multiple prefixes and parallelize requests. Here is why. S3 scales request performance per partition prefix, so multiple active prefixes can provide higher aggregate request throughput. Why are the other options not correct? A. Object tags do not create request partitions. B. One root prefix concentrates the workload under a single prefix baseline. C. Storage class selection affects cost and retrieval characteristics, not prefix-level request scaling. Exam tip. S3 automatically scales and high-throughput workloads can increase aggregate performance by using parallel requests across multiple prefixes. Question number 330. Application log stream to CloudWatch logs. An SNS topic already emails the development team and the team must be notified when a log event contains the term error. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Create a direct SNS subscription filter on the log group. Option B. Create a metric filter for error publish matching events as a CloudWatch metric and create an alarm that sends to the SNS topic when the metric is at least 1. Option C. Put the filter pattern directly in a CloudWatch alarm without creating a metric or log alarm. Option D. Use a logs insights query object that is not connected to an alarm. The correct answer is B. Create a metric filter for error, publish matching events as a CloudWatch metric, and create an alarm that sends to the SNS topic when the metric is at least 1. Here is why. The metric filter converts matching log events into a numerical metric, and the alarm invokes the existing SNS notification action. Why are the other options not correct? A. CloudWatch log subscription filters do not support SNS as a direct destination. C. A traditional metric alarm requires a metric rather than a raw log filter pattern. D. A standalone query does not automatically notify the team. Exam tip. Use a logs metric filter plus a CloudWatch alarm when an SNS notification depends on a log pattern count. Question number 331. An SQS carries confidential records between microservices. The team must ensure that message bodies are encrypted while stored in the queue without adding client-side encryption code. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Require AWS secure transport in the queue policy. Option B. Add a message attribute named InterYPT with a value of true. Option C. Enable SQS server-side encryption with an SQS managed key. Option D. Attach an ACM certificate to each send message request. The correct answer is C. Enable SQS server-side encryption with an SQS managed key. Here is why. SSE-SQS encrypts SQS message bodies at rest with a key managed by the SQS service and requires no client-side encryption implementation. Why are the other options not correct? A secure transport enforces TLS for data in transit only. B. Message attributes do not activate encryption. D. ACM certificates are not attached to individual SQS messages. Exam tip. Use SSESQS or SSEKMS for SQS data at rest and TLS policies for data in transit. Question number 332. One API gateway route has become slow. Its Lambda integration calls several HTTP endpoints and AWS services, and the developer needs a distributed view of how long each downstream dependency takes. Which approach follows operational best practices? Option A. Apply anomaly detection only to the Lambda duration and throttles metrics. Option B. Add manual timestamp log statements around every external call and compare the logs. Option C. Run a CloudWatch synthetics canary against the complete website and use only canary metrics. Option D. Instrument downstream calls for X-ray tracing, enable active tracing, and inspect the service map and traces for dependency latency. The correct answer is D. Instrument downstream calls for X-ray tracing, enable active tracing, and inspect the service map and traces for dependency latency. Here is why. Traced HTTP and AWS SDK calls create subsegments that show downstream dependencies and their response times, helping isolate the source of API latency. Why are the other options not correct? A function-level metrics do not identify which dependency is slow. B. Manual timestamp logging adds custom correlation and analysis work. C. A canary measures the external journey but does not expose every internal dependency. Exam tip. Use distributed tracing for dependency-level latency. AWS recommends OpenTelemetry for new X-ray instrumentation. Question number 333. A Lambda function receives IoT messages, performs message processing, and also performs initialization and cleanup work. The team needs a near real-time throughput measurement, based only on messages received and successfully processed during each period. Which implementation meets the requirement? Option A. Divide the Lambda invocations metric by the duration metric. Option B. Publish custom CloudWatch metric values at the message received and message processed points in the function. Option C. Use concurrent executions as the message throughput metric. Option D. Write throughput calculations to logs and run a scheduled event bridge process to parse them later. The correct answer is B. Publish custom CloudWatch metric values at the message received and message process points in the function. Here is why. Custom metrics measure the exact business operations and exclude unrelated initialization and cleanup time from the throughput calculation. Why are the other options not correct? A. Invocations and total duration include non-message work and do not count processed messages directly. C. Concurrent executions measures parallel function environments, not message throughput. D. Scheduled log processing is not near real-time and adds components. Exam tip. Publish custom metrics when service metrics do not represent the precise business operation required by an SLA. Question number 334. A Java application's code pipeline workflow must start whenever a new version of a shared jar dependency is published. The dependency needs a managed package repository rather than a container registry. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Publish the JAR to code artifact and use an event bridge rule for package version events to start the pipeline. Option B. Put the JAR in an ECR repository and use an ECR source action. Option C. Put the JAR in S3 and rely on an SNS notification to act as a code pipeline source. Option D. Put the JAR in ECR and use an SNS notification to start the build. The correct answer is A. Publish the JAR to code artifact and use an event bridge rule for package version events to start the pipeline. Here is why. Code artifact is a managed package repository for Java dependencies and emits package version events that event bridge can use to start code pipeline. Why are the other options not correct? B. CR stores container images, not Maven-style JAR packages. C. S3 plus SNS is not the native package version integration described. D. CR remains the wrong artifact repository, and SNS does not correct that mismatch. Exam tip. Use code artifact for language packages and event bridge to react to package version state changes. Question number 335. Before updating a CloudFormation stack, a team wants to preview which resources will be Added, modified, replaced, or deleted? Which CloudFormation feature should the team examine? Option A, stack policies. Option B, the template metadata section. Option C, a change set. Option D, the template resources section by itself. The correct answer is C, a change set. Here is why. A change set previews the actions CloudFormation will take, including in-place modifications, replacements, additions, and removals. Why are the other options not correct? A stack policies restrict update actions, but do not preview the proposed update. B, metadata stores supplementary template information. D, resources declares desired state, but does not calculate the impact against the running stack. Exam tip. Create and review a CloudFormation change set before executing a significant stack update. Question number 336. A Lambda function calls EventBridge put events through an AWS SDK without explicitly supplying credentials. The invocation logs show access denied exception. What should the developer change? Option A. Add a Lambda resource-based policy that grants the function permission to call put events. Option B. Add events. Put events to the Lambda execution role. Option C. Establish VPC peering between Lambda and EventBridge. Option D. Modify the developer's local IAM credentials. The correct answer is B. Add events. Put events to the Lambda execution role. Here is why. The SDK obtains temporary credentials from the function execution role, which must authorize the function to publish events to EventBridge. Why are the other options not correct? A Lambda resource policy controls who can invoke Lambda, not what Lambda can call. C. EventBridge API authorization does not require VPC peering. D. Local developer credentials are not used by the deployed function. Exam tip. Add downstream AWS API permissions to the Lambda execution role. Question number 337. Regional offices upload daily reports to S3 at approximately the same time. 1 Lambda. Invocation must analyze the complete set once per day at a defined clock time rather than running once for every upload. Which solution is most cost-effective? Option A. Keep the Lambda function running continuously and check the current time. Option B. Use a step function state machine solely to invoke the function on a daily schedule. Option C. Create an EventBridge scheduled rule that invokes the function at the required time. Option D. Configure every S3 object created event to invoke the function. The correct answer is C. Create an EventBridge scheduled rule that invokes the function at the required time. Here is why. A scheduled rule invokes Lambda once at the defined daily time without servers, or a workflow created only for scheduling. Why are the other options not correct? A. Continuous execution is unsupported and wasteful. B. Step functions adds unnecessary workflow resources. D. S3 notifications would invoke the function separately for each branch upload. Exam tip. Use EventBridge Scheduler or a scheduled rule for time-based Lambda invocation. Question number 338. An application invokes Lambda asynchronously. Events that still fail after Lambda retry. Processing must be retained so that the same function can process them again later with minimal operational work. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Configure an SQS dead letter queue for the asynchronous function and use that queue as an event source when reprocessing is required. Option B. Export filtered cloud watch logs to S3 and reconstruct failed payloads manually. Option C. Route all requests through EventBridge and SNS without configuring failure retention. Option D. Add a second SQS queue through EventBridge for every normal invocation. The correct answer is A. Configure an SQS dead letter queue for the asynchronous function and use that queue as an event source when reprocessing is required. Here is why. Lambda sends discarded asynchronous events to the DL queue after retries, and an SQS DL queue can later invoke the function again for managed reprocessing. Why are the other options not correct? B. Logs do not reliably preserve the complete original event for replay. C. It does not configure failed event retention. D. It changes every invocation path instead of handling only exhausted failures. Exam tip. Use an SQS standard DLQ to retain exhausted asynchronous Lambda events and replay them through an event source mapping. Question number 339. An EC2 application in Account B needs temporary cross-account access to a DynamoDB table in Account A. Account A already has a role named access-sensitive data that permits table access and trusts Account B. Which two changes are required in Account B? Choose 2. Option A. Grant the EC2 role direct DynamoDB permissions for the Account A table only. Option B. Allow the EC2 instance role to call STS. Assume role on access-sensitive data. Option C. Call getSessionToken in the application to obtain table credentials. Option D. Use the EC2 role's existing credentials directly without assuming the cross-account role. Call assume role from the application and use the return temporary credentials for DynamoDB requests. The correct answer is B. Allow the EC2 instance role to call STS. Assume role on access-sensitive data. Call assume role from the application and use the return temporary credentials for DynamoDB requests. Here is why. The caller role needs permission to assume the trusted role. And STS returns temporary credentials whose role permissions allow access to the Account A table. Why are the other options not correct? A direct permissions in Account B do not replace assuming the trusted account A role. C. getSessionToken does not assume the cross-account role. D. The original EC2 credentials do not automatically acquire the target role's permissions. Exam tip. Cross-account role access requires both target role trust and caller permission to invoke STS. Assume role. Question number 340. A marketplace trade must update two users' ownership records atomically. Either both updates must commit or neither update may remain. Which two data store approaches provide the required transaction semantics? Choose 2. Option A. Use DynamoDB transact write items or related transact asterisk operations. Option B. Use DynamoDB reads with consistent read set to true. Option C. Use Athena statements inside a transaction block. Option D. Use Aurora MySQL statements within a database transaction. Use Elastic Cache for memcached operations inside a transaction block. The correct answer is A. Use DynamoDB transact write items or related transact asterisk operations. D. Use Aurora MySQL statements within a database transaction. Here is why. DynamoDB transactions provide all-or-nothing supported item operations, and Aurora MySQL supports ACID relational transactions with commit and rollback. Why are the other options not correct? B. Strongly consistent reads do not make multiple writes atomic. C. Athena is a query service and is not the transactional application store described. E. Memcached does not provide durable multi-record database transactions. Exam tip. Use DynamoDB transact asterisk APIs or relational database transactions when multiple updates must commit atomically. Question number 341. A CloudFormation template must initialize an application with an existing RDS hostname. The hostname is stored as a plaintext string parameter in parameter store and is not exported by another stack. How should the template retrieve the value? Option A. Use FN. Import value. Option B. Use an SSM secure dynamic reference. Option C. Use an SSM dynamic reference. Option D. Use ref on the unrelated RDS resource. The correct answer is C. Use an SSM dynamic reference. Here is why. The resolve SSM dynamic reference retrieves a plaintext parameter store string value when CloudFormation creates or updates the stack. Why are the other options not correct? A import value consumes a value exported by another CloudFormation stack. B. SSM secure is for secure string parameters. D. Ref does not retrieve an arbitrary existing parameter store value unless using a parameter type designed for that purpose. Exam tip. Use SSM for plaintext parameter store values and SSM secure for supported secure string references. Question number 342. A Lambda function calls a third-party API that permits only a fixed number of simultaneous requests. The developer must prevent the function from exceeding that concurrency limit. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Increase the function timeout. Option B. Set provisioned concurrency to the third party's limit. Option C. Set reserved concurrency to the third party's allowed simultaneous request count. Option D. Reduce the function memory allocation. The correct answer is C. Set reserved concurrency to the third party's allowed simultaneous request count. Here is why. Reserved concurrency limits the function's maximum simultaneous executions, thereby bounding concurrent calls to the external API. Why are the other options not correct? A timeout changes execution duration. B. Provisioned concurrency pre-initializes environments, but does not impose the intended maximum by itself. D. Memory does not enforce concurrency. Exam tip. Use reserved concurrency to cap simultaneous Lambda executions. Question number 343. A containerized service is deployed during development with AWS Copilot. Its source is in code commit, and the team wants Copilot to provision the standard automated release pipeline with the least custom infrastructure code. Which approach should the developer use? Option A. Write a custom CloudFormation code pipeline template and install it as a Copilot add-on. Option B. Define a Copilot pipeline, select code commit as its source, and deploy the generated code pipeline through the Copilot CLI. Option C. Bootstrap a SAM pipeline and invoke Copilot commands from it. Option D. Write a custom build spec that creates a second Copilot managed pipeline from code build. The correct answer is B. Define a Copilot pipeline, select code commit as its source, and deploy the generated code pipeline through the Copilot CLI. Here is why. Copilot pipeline commands generate and deploy the standard code pipeline resources for a Copilot application with minimal custom infrastructure work. Why are the other options not correct? A. A custom pipeline template duplicates Copilot's pipeline capability. C. SAM pipeline bootstrap targets serverless application workflows. D. A custom build spec and nested pipeline creation add unnecessary complexity. Exam tip. Use Copilot pipeline init and pipeline deploy for the managed CI/CD workflow of a Copilot application. Question number 344. A DynamoDB table for a rewards application needs a partition key that distributes traffic well and avoids predictable low cardinality hotkeys. Which candidate is the best choice? Option A. The date the customer enrolled. Option B. The customer's full name. Option C. The customer's pet name. Option D. A randomly generated UUID for each customer record. The correct answer is D. A randomly generated UUID for each customer record. Here is why. UUID values have high cardinality and distribute items and request traffic across a broad partition key space. Why are the other options not correct? A. Enrollment dates can group many customers under the same value. B. Names are not guaranteed unique and can be skewed. C. Pet names have low uniqueness and uneven distribution. Exam tip. Prefer high cardinality, well-distributed DynamoDB partition keys over natural attributes with repeated values. Question number 345. AWS CLI and SDK calls from a workstation previously succeeded through IAM Identity Center. No scripts, profiles, permission sets, or target accounts have changed, but the calls now return access errors after the session has been idle. What is the most likely cause? Option A. The temporary credentials for the IAM Identity Center session expired. Option B. The AWS CLI executable lost file permissions. Option C. The application is now calling a different AWS account. Option D. The assigned permission set was changed even though the scenario states that configuration did not change. The correct answer is A. The temporary credentials for the IAM Identity Center session expired. Here is why. IAM Identity Center CLI sessions use cached temporary credentials that expire and must be refreshed by signing in again. Why are the other options not correct? B. File permission changes would usually prevent CLI execution, rather than create a normal AWS access response. C. The target account did not change. D. The scenario states that permission configuration was unchanged. Exam tip. Rerun AWS SSO login when cached IAM Identity Center credentials expire. Question number 346. A Lambda function must keep a third-party API key in its runtime configuration. The company requires a KMS key that it creates and controls, and only authorized principals may decrypt. The value. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Store the key as a plaintext parameter store string encrypted only by the default key. Option B. Commit the key to source control and encrypt the repository with an AWS managed key. Option C. Store the key in a Lambda environment variable encrypted with a customer-managed KMS key. Option D. Store the key in DynamoDB with an AWS managed key. The correct answer is C. Store the key in a Lambda environment variable encrypted with a customer-managed KMS key. Here is why. Lambda can encrypt environment variables with a customer-managed KMS key, allowing the company to control the key policy and decrypt permissions. Why are the other options not correct? A. A string parameter is not an encrypted secure string, and the default key is not customer-controlled. B. Source repositories are not appropriate secret stores. D. An AWS managed key does not provide the required customer key control. Exam tip. Use a customer-managed KMS key when Lambda environment variable encryption needs customer-controlled authorization. Question number 347. EC2 web servers behind an internet-facing application load balancer currently record only the load balancer address in their access logs. The developer needs the logs to include the original client public address. Which change is required? Option A. Log the host request header. Option B. Configure the web server to log the X forwarded for header. Option C. Install the X-ray daemon and redirect it to the access log. Option D. Install the Cloud Watchlogs agent to rewrite the source address. The correct answer is B. Configure the web server to log the X forwarded for header. Here is why. The ALB adds the originating client address to X forwarded for before forwarding the request to the target. Why are the other options not correct? A host identifies the requested host name, not the client IPC. X-ray does not rewrite HTTP access log client addresses. D. The logs agent ships logs but does not create the missing header field. Exam tip. Parse and log the X forwarded for chain when an HTTP application runs behind an ALB. Question number 348. A sensitive internal web application must become internet reachable without changing its application code. Only employees authenticated by the company's OIDC provider may reach the backend. Which two configurations meet the requirement? Choose two. Option A. Place the application behind a public application load balancer. Option B. Place the application behind a public network load balancer. Option C. Add an HTTP port 80 listener with an authenticate OIC action. Option D. Add an HTTPS port 443 listener whose default rule uses authenticate OIC before forwarding. E. Add a Lambda action to the listener instead of native OIDC authentication. The correct answer is A. Place the application behind a public application load balancer. D. Add an HTTPS port 443 listener whose default rule uses authenticate OIC before forwarding. Here is why. ALB HTTPS listeners support native OIDC authentication and can authenticate employees before forwarding requests to an unchanged backend. Why are the other options not correct? B. Network load balancers do not provide ALB authenticate OIC actions. C. Authentication actions are supported only on HTTPS listeners. E. A custom Lambda action is unnecessary and is not the native listener authentication configuration. Exam tip. Use an ALB HTTPS authenticate OIC action to add identity provider authentication without changing the application. Question number 349. A web team needs to keep unfinished capabilities disabled for users and enable them independently of application deployment when they are ready. Which solution should the developer use? Option A. Use DynamoDB streams to switch records between hidden and visible states. Option B. Create an AWS AppConfig feature flag configuration profile and update flag values as needed. Option C. Use an AppSync feature flag configuration profile. Option D. Use amplified data store synchronization as the feature control mechanism. The correct answer is B. Create an AWS AppConfig feature flag configuration profile and update flag values as needed. Here is why. AppConfig feature flags separate feature activation from code deployment and support controlled configuration rollout and rollback. Why are the other options not correct? A DynamoDB streams capture item changes, but are not a feature flag service. C. AppSync has no AppConfig style feature flag profile. D. Data store synchronization is not a release control mechanism. Exam tip. Use AppConfig feature flags to hide, expose, or target features without deploying new code. Question number 350. CloudFront will be placed in front of an internet-facing ALB. Customer traffic must use encryption from the viewer to CloudFront and from CloudFront to the ALB. Which two CloudFront settings meet the requirement? Choose 2. Option A. Enable automatic compression. Option B. Require signed URLs. Option C. Set the origin protocol policy to match viewer. Option D. Enable field-level encryption only. E. Set the viewer protocol policy to redirect HTTP to HTTPS. The correct answer is C. Set the origin protocol policy to match viewer. E. Set the viewer protocol policy to redirect HTTP to HTTPS. Here is why. Redirect HTTP to HTTPS protects viewer to CloudFront traffic. Because viewers then use HTTPS, match viewer makes CloudFront connect to the ALB over HTTPS as well. Why are the other options not correct? A. Compression does not provide encryption. B. Signed URLs restrict access but do not select transport protocols. D. Field-level encryption protects selected fields and does not replace TLS for both connections. Exam tip. Configure both the viewer protocol policy and origin protocol policy when end-to-end HTTPS is required through CloudFront. Question number 351. A CloudWatch Logs log group was created 2 months ago. The developer now needs all newly ingested log data to use a specified customer-managed KMS key with minimal changes. Which action should the developer take? Option A. Run AWS Logs Associate KMS key for the existing log group and provide the KMS key ARN. Option B. Recreate the log group with AWS Logs Create Log Group. Option C. Encrypt every log event and application code with the AWS Encryption SDK. Option D. Associate the key from the KMS console without updating the log group configuration. The correct answer is A. Run AWS Logs Associate KMS key for the existing log group and provide the KMS key ARN. Here is why. Associate KMS key adds or changes the KMS key associated with an existing CloudWatch Logs log group so newly ingested data uses that key. Why are the other options not correct? B. Create log group cannot recreate an existing group without migration. C. Client-side log encryption adds code and can reduce logs functionality. D. The KMS console alone does not associate the key with the log group. Exam tip. Use associate KMS key for an existing log group and KMS key ID during creation for a new one. Question number 352. A workload needs temporary access to resources owned by another AWS account. The solution must avoid sharing long-term credentials. Which approach is most secure? Option A. Email an IAM access key created in the second account. Option B. Add an SSH public key to an IAM user in the second account. Option C. Use a Cognito user pool as a source of AWS credentials. Option D. Create a trusted cross-account role and call STS assume role for temporary credentials. The correct answer is D. Create a trusted cross-account role and call STS assume role for temporary credentials. Here is why. Assume role returns short-lived credentials scoped by the role's permissions without transferring long-term secrets between accounts. Why are the other options not correct? A mailing access keys exposes durable credentials. B. SSH keys do not authorize AWS Service API access. C. Cognito user pools authenticate application users and do not directly provide cross-account AWS credentials. Exam tip. Use a trusted IAM role and STS assume role for temporary cross-account access. Question number 353. A developer is implementing a Lambda function for S3 object-created events and wants to test an equivalent invocation entirely on a local workstation before deployment. Which workflow has the least operational overhead? Option A. Upload to the production S3 bucket and wait for AWS to invoke a local function. Option B. Use SAM CLI to generate an S3 put event and pass the generated event to SAM local invoke. Option C. Use a WS Lambda invoke against a function that has not been deployed. Option D. Create a test event in the AWS console for a function running only on the workstation. The correct answer is B. Use SAM CLI to generate an S3 put event and pass the generated event to SAM local invoke. Here is why. SAM CLI generates a representative S3 event and runs the function locally in a Lambda-like container without deploying AWS resources. Why are the other options not correct? A S3 cannot invoke a function running only on a local workstation. C. A WS Lambda invoke calls a deployed Lambda function. D. The AWS console cannot invoke an undeployed local function. Exam tip. Use SAM local generate event with SAM local invoke to test event-driven Lambda handlers locally. Question number 354. A CloudFormation application stack must consume subnet identifiers created by a separate network stack. The first application stack deployment fails because the cross-stack reference is incomplete. Which two template defects could cause the failure? Choose 2. Option A. The application stack does not use FN import value to retrieve the exported subnet values. Option B. The application stack does not place the subnet IDs in its mappings section. Option C. The application stack does not use ref for resources that exist only in another stack. Option D. The network stack does not list subnet values in its mappings section. E. The network stack does not export the subnet values from its output section. The correct answer is A. The application stack does not use FN import value to retrieve the exported subnet values. E. The network stack does not export the subnet values from its output section. Here is why. Cross-stack references require the producing stack to export an output and the consuming stack to retrieve that export with FN import value. Why are the other options not correct? B. Mappings are static lookup tables and are not required for cross-stack references. C. Ref cannot directly reference a resource in a different stack. D. Exports are declared in outputs, not mappings. Exam tip. Cross-stack references use outputs. Export in the producer and FN import value in the consumer. Question number 355. An EC2 application uses an attached IAM role, but cannot read an S3 bucket because the role policy lacks the required action. The developer wants the smallest possible disruption. What should the developer do? Option A. Add permission to the bucket and restart the instance. Option B. Add the role permission, hibernate the instance and start it again. Option C. Update the role policy. The instance will use the change permissions automatically. Option D. Terminate the instance after changing the policy and launch a replacement. The correct answer is C. Update the role policy. The instance will use the change permissions automatically. Here is why. The instance profile continues supplying role credentials, and new temporary credentials reflect the role's updated permissions without replacing or restarting EC2. Why are the other options not correct? A bucket policy could grant access but a restart is unnecessary. B. Hibernation is unnecessary. D. Terminating the instance creates avoidable disruption. Exam tip. IAM role policy updates apply to applications using refreshed temporary role credentials without instance replacement. Question number 356. A Lambda function must connect to an RDS database in private VPC subnets. Its execution role already contains the required AWS permissions. Which additional configuration enables network connectivity? Option A. Attach the function to suitable private subnets and security groups, and allow the function security group to reach the database security group. Option B. Assign a public address to RDS and allow the Lambda functions changing address. Option C. Put CloudFront between Lambda and the database. Option D. Establish direct connect between two resources that are already in AWS. The correct answer is A. Attach the function to suitable private subnets and security groups, and allow the function security group to reach the database security group. Here is why. VPC configuration gives Lambda network interfaces in the selected subnets, and security group rules permit the database connection. Why are the other options not correct? B. A private database does not need public exposure. C. CloudFront does not proxy database protocols. D. Direct Connect links external networks to AWS, and is irrelevant inside the VPC. Exam tip. Lambda needs both execution role permissions and VPC network configuration to reach a private RDS endpoint. Question number 357. An application is moving to one EC2 instance and will store objects in S3. The company wants least privilege access without embedding AWS access keys in the code. Which configuration follows security best practices? Option A. Attach an administrator IAM role to the instance. Option B. Create an administrator IAM user and hardcode its keys. Option C. Create a least privilege IAM user and hardcode its keys. Option D. Attach an EC2 instance profile role containing only the required S3 permissions. The correct answer is D. Attach an EC2 instance profile role containing only the required S3 permissions. Here is why. The instance role supplies automatically rotated temporary credentials and can be restricted to the exact S3 actions and resources the application needs. Why are the other options not correct? A. Administrator access violates least privilege. B. Administrator user keys are excessive and embedded credentials are unsafe. C. Least privilege user keys still require storage and rotation. Exam tip. Use an EC2 instance profile with a least privilege role instead of application access keys. Question number 358. A CPU-intensive Python image processor was moved from a desktop to Lambda. The scheduled invocation works, but processing now takes more than twice as long. The function code should remain unchanged. Which configuration is most likely to improve runtime performance? Option A. Configure reserved concurrency. Option B. Increase the Lambda memory allocation. Option C. Select a compute-optimized EC2 instance type for Lambda. Option D. Change runtimes without profiling or code compatibility testing. The correct answer is B. Increase the Lambda memory allocation. Here is why. Lambda allocates additional CPU as memory increases, which can reduce the duration of CPU-intensive image processing. Why are the other options not correct? A reserved concurrency controls scaling, not per invocation compute. C. Lambda does not expose EC2 instance type selection. D. A newer runtime does not guarantee sufficient CPU or faster processing. Exam tip. Benchmark higher Lambda memory settings for CPU-bound work, because memory and CPU scale together. Question number 359. A CloudFormation update attempted to enlarge an RDS instance. The update failed and the stack then entered update on rollbacks for failed, instead of completing the rollback. Which condition most directly explains why CloudFormation could not restore the previous state? Option A. The template contains a syntax error that should have prevented the update from starting. Option B. The requested new DB instance class was invalid, but the previous instance still exists. Option C. The database was manually deleted or changed outside CloudFormation, so the old resource state required for rollback no longer matches reality. Option D. The caller lacks permission only to provision the newly requested instance class. The correct answer is C. The database was manually deleted or changed outside CloudFormation, so the old resource state required for rollback no longer matches reality. Here is why. Update_rollback_failed means the update failed in CloudFormation, also could not restore a previous resource. Out-of-band deletion or modification is a documented cause. Why are the other options not correct? A. A syntax error normally prevents a valid update operation from beginning. B. An invalid new class can fail the update, but rollback can still restore the existing database. D. Permission to create the new class can fail the update, but does not by itself establish why restoration of the old state failed. Exam tip. Investigate stack events and resource drift when a stack reaches update and rollback failed. Question number 360. A DynamoDB table with an LSI reports provision throughput exceeded exception during a test, although total requests remain below the table's provision throughput. What is the most likely cause? Option A. The IAM policy permits the table but not the LSI. Option B. The LSI has independent provision throughput that is lower than the table. Option C. Missing retry logic itself creates the initial throttling condition. Option D. Requests are concentrated on a poorly distributed partition key value, creating a hot partition. The correct answer is D. Requests are concentrated on a poorly distributed partition key value, creating a hot partition. Here is why. DynamoDB can throttle one physical partition when traffic is uneven, even though aggregate requests remain below the table's total provisioned capacity. Why are the other options not correct? A missing index permission produces access denied, rather than throughput throttling. B. An LSI shares its base table's provision throughput. C. Backoff handles throttling after it occurs, but does not create the original hot partition. Exam tip. Overall DynamoDB capacity does not prevent hot partition throttling. Design partition keys to distribute traffic. Question number 361. A serverless API uses API gateway and Lambda proxy integrations. The team adds a /landing page resource with the get method that uses a mock integration. The method must return an HTML navigation page with HTTP status 200 without invoking a backend. Which mapping configuration completes the method? Option A. Return status code 200 from an application/JSON integration request template, and place the landing page HTML in a text/HTML integration response template. Option B. Put the HTML in a text/HTML integration request template and return application/JSON from the integration response. Option C. Return status 200 from a text/HTML request template and place the HTML in an application/JSON response template. Option D. Put the HTML in an application/JSON request template and configure only a text/HTML method response. The correct answer is A. Return status code 200 from an application/JSON integration request template and place the landing page HTML in a text/HTML integration response template. Here is why. A mock integration uses the request template to select the response status. The integration response then maps that status to the HTML body and content type returned to the client. Why are the other options not correct? B. The request template should produce the mock status value, not the final HTML body. C. The request and response content types are reversed. D. A method response alone does not create the mock integration payload. Exam tip. API gateway mock requests generate a status selector. Integration responses generate the client-facing body and headers. Question number 362. A critical ECS service is being moved from EC2 launch type to Fargate. The cluster must be associated with the predefined Fargate and Fargate_spot capacity providers, and the minimum guaranteed tasks must run on Fargate. Which configuration is appropriate? Option A. Call create capacity provider for Fargate and Fargate_spot. Then place the base on Fargate_spot. Option B. Call put cluster capacity providers to associate Fargate and Fargate_spot and configure the base value on Fargate. Option C. Call create capacity provider for both predefined providers and configure Fargate as a failover provider. Option D. Call put cluster capacity providers and configure the base value on Fargate_spot. The correct answer is B. Call put cluster capacity providers to associate Fargate and Fargate_spot and configure the base value on Fargate. Here is why. The predefined providers are associated with the cluster through put cluster capacity providers, and the base guarantees the minimum task count on Fargate. Why are the other options not correct? A and C. Create capacity provider is not used to create the predefined Fargate providers. D. A base on spot is unsuitable for the guaranteed minimum. Exam tip. Associate predefined Fargate providers with put cluster capacity providers. Question number 363. A code build project frequently downloads the same large Java dependencies from code artifact. The dependency directory is between 0.5 GB and 1.5 GB, and the developer wants later builds to reuse those files instead of retrieving them again. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Store buildspec.yml in code artifact and list the repository name as a cache path. Option B. Enable a code build custom local cache and add the dependency cache directory to the buildspec cache path. Option C. Enable a local cache and use the code artifact repository name as the cache directory. Option D. Configure an S3 build cache but omit the dependency directory from buildspec.yml. The correct answer is B. Enable a code build custom local cache and add the dependency cache directory to the buildspec cache path. Here is why. Code build custom local caching preserves the dependency directory on reused build hosts and reduces repeated downloads from code artifact. Why are the other options not correct? A code artifact repository names are not build cache paths. C. The actual package manager cache directory must be specified. D. Omitting paths does not reliably cache the required dependency directory. Exam tip. For code artifact dependency reuse in code build, enable custom local caching and list the package manager cache directory in buildspec.yml. Question number 364. Developers in multiple locations need secure access to existing code commit repositories. Across several AWS accounts, the company wants centralized workforce access with minimal, per developer IAM administration. Which solution is most operationally efficient? Option A. Distribute shared AWS access keys to the development team. Option B. Create and maintain a separate IAM role assignment for every developer in every account. Option C. Use IAM identity center permission sets and assign the developers access to the required AWS accounts. Option D. Configure unmanaged public SSH keys independently in every repository account. The correct answer is C. Use IAM identity center permission sets and assign the developers access to the required AWS accounts. Here is why. IAM Identity Center centralizes workforce identities and applies reusable permission sets across multiple accounts without distributing long-term credentials. Why are the other options not correct? A. Shared access keys are insecure and difficult to audit. B. Individual role administration in every account creates unnecessary overhead. D. Per account SSH key management does not provide centralized multi-account access. Exam tip. Use IAM Identity Center permission sets for centrally managed workforce access across AWS accounts. Question number 365. A cloud formation stack is in delete_failed because one IAM role could not be removed. The team wants to finish deleting the stack and handle that resource separately. Which recovery action should the developer take? Option A. Add depends onto the failed resource after the stack deletion has started. Option B. Retry delete stack with retain resources for the failed logical resource, then delete the retained resource manually when appropriate. Option C. Pass a non-existent force parameter with the resource role ARN. Option D. Open a support case without first retrying the documented deletion workflow. The correct answer is B. Retry delete stack with retain resources for the failed logical resource, then delete the retained resource manually when appropriate. Here is why. Retain resources lets CloudFormation complete deletion, while leaving the problem resource for separate cleanup. Why are the other options not correct? A depends on does not repair an already failing delete operation. C. CloudFormation has no such force parameter. D. The documented recovery should be attempted first. Exam tip. For delete_failed, retry stack deletion while retaining the resource that cannot be removed. Question number 366. A CloudFront distribution serves a high-traffic application. The operations team needs a dashboard that displays request errors and anomalies with the lowest available log latency. Which two actions meet the requirement? Choose 2. Option A. Send standard cloud front logs to S3 and query them periodically with Athena. Option B. Enable CloudFront real-time logs and deliver them to a Kinesis data stream. Option C. Send the real-time stream through Lambda to OpenSearch service and build the dashboard. In OpenSearch dashboards. Option D. Send CloudFront logs to Firehose and then to CloudTrail. E. Build CloudTrail alarms from CloudFront access log records. The correct answer is B. Enable CloudFront real-time logs and deliver them to a Kinesis data stream. C. Send the real-time stream through Lambda to OpenSearch service and build the dashboard in OpenSearch dashboards. Here is why. Real-time logs reach Kinesis within seconds. Lambda can transform and index the records in OpenSearch, where dashboards can visualize status codes, error rates, and anomalies. Why are the other options not correct? A standard logs delivered to S3 have higher latency. D. Firehose is not the configured direct destination for CloudFront real-time logs. E. CloudTrail records AWS API activity, not viewer request logs. Exam tip. CloudFront real-time log stream to Kinesis data streams for low-latency analysis. You have completed Part 9 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.